Hello, and welcome to the Road to Autonomy Podcast. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. The Road to Autonomy Podcast is brought to you in part by Florida Internet and Television. It's time to cut the tax on tech. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have a gentleman that is a friend and an incredible human being and a great father. State Senator Jeff Brandes of Florida. Welcome to the podcast, sir.
Hey, thanks. Great to be with you.
Super happy to have you here. Senator Brandes, you served in the United States Army Reserve as a transportation officer from 1996 to 2007, and you served in Operation Iraqi Freedom. How did this experience impact you, and what did you take away from it?
I think one of the big things I took away from being over in Iraq was I read this book called Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. And I realized I was probably more on the libertarian end of the Republican side. And I think that's really affected how I see the world and choose to govern or propose legislation. That and between, running convoys throughout Iraq, I realized, boy, it'd be a lot safer if I didn't have to have soldiers in these convoys and we could do them autonomously. So that's probably what made me so intrigued by the whole idea of the future of transportation and mobility.
You saw it as a way to increase efficiency and save lives, and is that what kind of got you when you introduced legislation in 2012?
Yeah, I realized, looking for big ideas. So when I came into 2012, we really kind of are trying to separate ourselves out from the pack of what was a great legislative class. A lot of congressmen, leaders in the state have come out of that class and trying to figure out what's the pathway forward for me. And was captivated that there's one big idea in every area of public policy. So try to look for those big ideas. I came across Sebastian Thrun's TED Talk, which I thought was just incredible and really captivated. Probably watched that a dozen times before I reached out to Google and sought their assistance in kind of really drafting some of the first laws in the country as it relates to the world of self-driving.
What was the expression when you either got David Estrada or one of the attorneys at Google on the phone? Was it like, are you serious? Is this Florida really wants to do this?
It was a no to begin with, right? It was, you're a freshman legislator from the state of Florida. Like we're in California. We have we're not even thinking about this right now. And I said, well, look, I called them back a couple weeks later and I said, I'm planning to do it anyways because I think this is the big idea. And I'm sorry if I screw it up. And I got a call a few days later and they said, hey, look, we're all in. We're happy to help with our legals team and we'll send some vehicles. And so, I that's where I met kind of the founders of so many of these different companies, was back from that early engagement back in 2012.
And that early engagement led to, at that time, Governor Rick Scott signing your bill into law. As a freshman House representative, how did that make you feel? You've got your big idea, the governor signed it, and how did that make you feel?
Well, I think, nobody really knew what the future held, especially for Florida at the time. But for me, we were excited to be working on and having passed what we thought was a big idea and to see the things that have come out of that, right? Because I'm kind of like, the story about Mikey, like give it to Mikey, he'll do it, right? So that became, give it to Brandes, he'll run whatever the big, bold idea in mobility was. So that led to an introduction to the early team at Google and at Uber and Lyft, which then followed on with a conversation about e-bikes and scooters, and have now led to the 3.0 version of self-driving and all of the relationships we've built over the time. So for me, it's been really cool to kind of grow up with the world of self-driving and automation, and to participate in those conversations for, frankly, the last decade.
It's special because you recruited me to Florida. When I lived in California, and I always look at Florida, I was like, okay, here's a leader that understands to tackle the big ideas. And you did really big things. And I'll never forget it. I'm sitting there having a coffee one day, and I opened the Wall Street Journal, and there's a picture of Governor Rick Scott and going for a drive in the Audi in Tampa. I was like, okay, Florida's really doing this. They put the sitting U.S. governor in the vehicle. And in California, we're just trying to get any local politician to go in the vehicle. That was a big, major milestone step.
Well, think about now, we have a variety of different companies operating here, whether it be Argo down in Miami, whether it be Voyage, Starsky was operating here for a long time. I mean, we've got a number of companies that are coming. Google's doing rain testing here. We've developed an autonomous vehicle testing facility over in Lakeland. We've got a variety of different pilots going on connected vehicles. But I think what we've seen is it really changed the conversation about mobility in Florida in a way that made us from a state that really wasn't even part of the conversation to frankly a leading state in the conversation. And that occurred over 5 or 6 years. But if you talk to these companies, what they'll say, Florida has the best laws on its books as it relates to self-driving. We've got the best laws on the books as it relates to ride sharing. Well, we've worked hard on scooters and micromobility. And so what we've tried to do is position ourselves as a best-in-class state in every one of those laws and reap the fruits from it, right? If you create the right environment, the things that you want to grow here will grow here. And that's what we're seeing play out in autonomy and ride sharing and in all the other micromobility developments.
If you look back in history, go back to the 1960s when Walt Disney was alive and he started acquiring the land in Florida, the state did incredible things to allow him to grow Disney World. And to me, it was like, okay, you've got one of the world's leading innovators who's probably built, you can say, is one of the world's most famous brands with Mickey Mouse. He built it here in Florida because what they did to him in California. He came to Florida to build his true dream. And you're seeing that now with self-driving. Argo has come here. They're publicly operating in Miami. There's other companies that are coming. It seems like this is history repeating itself. The California dream is coming to Florida where you can actually build the dream. Because in California, you can't build the dream because I have to give you a lot of credit and the governor a lot of credit and the politicians a lot of credit because you're leveling the playing field to allow innovators to build businesses, raise families, and create high-paying jobs.
Well, we have to realize this is a global environment that we're dealing with. And so you have to be competitive globally, not just amongst the states. And so what can we do to remove the barriers? Florida has the perfect environment to operate these types of vehicles in, right? We know what the weather is going to be. We don't have to deal with snow. We know our road infrastructure is frankly newer in most areas than the rest of the country. And we don't have mountains and other challenges to deal with. And we have a huge population. Florida's got 22 million people growing to 26 million people by 2030, 130 million tourists. And that's growing every year. And so what we're seeing is we're the perfect environment to launch these types of programs in because the demand is there already. And then with that many tourists, you can export that knowledge and that experience when they go back home.
The thing about Florida that is outside of the technology from a logistical standpoint, to me, is the holy grail is if you connect Miami to the Space Coast, to Orlando, to Tampa, and then the tourists can have all these different experiences when they come in here. Brightline's working on that. But imagine you get off at the Brightline station in Orlando, and then you can take a self-driving car and you can go see the Space Coast, or you go to Tampa and you can go to Busch Gardens. There's all these experiences that are only possible in Florida because of leadership that the state has had throughout its history.
Yeah, I think if you look back, Florida's a mobility story as much as it is anything else, whether it be Henry Flagler or Walt Disney. These are all, mobility stories. And so where Florida has really shined, at least in the last decade, is in its expansion and growth and embracing of different mobility options. Lilium has announced that they're going to launch VTOL services in Florida, on top of what Brightline's doing with rail, on top of what Argo's doing with mobility. So I think what you're seeing is a variety of conversations going on. Florida's taking a leading role. Our laws are such that it incentivizes businesses to look at Florida over other states because of the ease of operation in the state. And frankly, you have a legislature that's fully supportive, bipartisanly fully supportive of these new ideas and bold initiatives.
Florida, another bold initiative we have to talk about is the Space Coast. I call it the comeback coast. It's absolutely incredible. You have SpaceX there doing incredible things, launching American astronauts on American soil, an American-built rocket. You have Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin, and then you have Ariane, which is building the world's first sonicless supersonic jet, all in the Space Coast. What happened? What was in the water that made the Space Coast have this incredible comeback?
Well, I think one, it had the infrastructure necessary to allow these types of facilities to be built and to utilize. And then two, I think it still had the engineering talent that was kind of ingrained in the culture of the Space Coast, was you had these engineers who had left NASA, but their families wanted to be here. They were really talented. And so now these other groups are coming in and finding that we have the university talent, the infrastructure necessary, and the regulatory environment that creates this kind of perfect ecosystem for new developments.
I'm happy you brought up the university system because you're seeing a lot of the stuff out of Miami with the companies because the University of Miami has a great program. There's the flight schools here and the University of Florida and FSU. Like we're graduating extremely well-talented kids. My only concern with Florida's current mobility vision is the new administration. Are they going to try and put any bureaucracy or stuff to kind of slow down Florida since Florida's leading on a variety of issues, not just mobility, and taking bold leadership decisions?
I don't think you're going to see. I mean, I think what you're going to see coming out of the new administration is really just a push to electric. I think in the other areas, if history is any guide, they have not really produced anything all that meaningful. I mean, we would call it glacial if glaciers weren't moving so fast, right? Like, if they're just so slow to do anything. And so I don't think we can worry about the feds. I think what they're going to largely do is just incentivize more electric, and you're going to see some pretty strong incentives on that front. Not that it really needs it all that much, because I think naturally by 2030, you could see 15 to 30% of your new car sales be electric. And so I don't really see there being a real strong need to incentivize more than what's already going to occur.
Will the funding to NASA still continue?
Yeah, absolutely. They're going to fund to NASA, but largely, I mean, I think what you're seeing is NASA has become a mobility broker, right? They just are in the mobility space of brokering, space flight. The talented individuals in NASA are now working for SpaceX or Blue Origin or the other providers. That's really where the talent is. And NASA is essentially a contracting firm that manages and creates the safety protocols.
Yeah, and I mean, VTOL came out. Mark Moore's NASA Puffin paper started the whole, you mentioned Lillian, that started that whole revolution towards VTOL. Is it legal to run a VTOL in the state of Florida, say go from Tampa to Miami? Is that legislatively legal?
Yeah, I don't think there's any hurdles legislatively on that. I mean, if there's anything, it's an FAA issue. But for the most part, I don't know that there's really any hurdles in Florida dealing with VTOL.
It's amazing. It's another clear example of not putting the California Public Utilities Commission on somebody's throat to stop a business.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about Florida is because we've been doing this for a decade. When you call up our Florida Department of Transportation, you're going to talk to somebody who has a base level of knowledge and is wired to say yes, not wired to say no. And so the predisposition to say, yes, let's figure out how to make this work is a sea change from what you see from California.
That's the number one thing that we've talked to any individual that in policy inside of these companies, we went from the no patrol to the how can we help you patrol.
Right.
And it's changing everything. And Florida's not just leading on mobility, an issue that's near and dear to your heart that you've gone out and taken an incredible leadership position and done really great things is criminal justice reform. Why and how did you first become interested in this issue?
Again, finding the big ideas. Where our team has found a lot of success is in playing in areas that really nobody else wanted to touch. Whether it be, nobody who really was taking on this idea of new mobility and kind of trying to look around the corner and see the future there. In the world of criminal justice, it's very similar. I mean, I predominantly work on 3 areas of public policy, mostly because they're hard and nobody really wants to spend the time, effort, and energy to really learn them: transportation, criminal justice, and insurance. They're all complicated and unique in their own ways, but in each one of those areas, our team is leading the conversation, either directly or frankly indirectly, by doing the research on the back end and then handing it off to the right person to run the legislation. But for the most part, what we're trying to do is identify the key problems, propose best of class solutions, and try to do everything we can to get the follow through done. And so I got involved in criminal justice 6 years ago when I sat on a criminal justice committee. Heard the story about an individual in South Florida that was acting out in his cell. The corrections officers there put him in a shower, turned the heat up all the way, and came back 2 hours later and he was dead. And I remember looking around, having this kind of visceral reaction that the legislature was kind of moving on from that topic to talk about something else, and realizing that I had one member on my left on his phone, somebody else looking at something on the internet, and they were just ready to kind of move on from that conversation. And I said, well, wait a second here. Let's go back and talk about this a little bit more. Let's dig into this. And from that, I began to tour prisons and began to build a base of knowledge. I'm not an attorney, so and had no real interaction with the criminal justice system. Began to build a base of knowledge on what was working and what was broken. And what I found was most things weren't working. In fact, Florida had created a criminal justice system that was negatively impacting public safety because of some of the decisions that had been pitched to improve public safety. And so the more I dug into it, the more recommendations we had to fix it. And we've adjusted some, not nearly as much as what I think needs to be done. And frankly, the Department of Corrections is still in many ways in crisis, or not in many ways, it's still in crisis, and is largely not a Department of Corrections, but really a Department of Warehousing.
Wow. What is it like when you tour a prison and you sit down and you listen to an inmate tell the story? Do they respect that you're there to listen to them to try and learn?
Yeah. I mean, look, whatever happens, anytime I visit a facility, within the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'm going to have 2 or 3 dozen letters that come in that want to talk through. I mean, I've got 3 or 4 on my desk right now that I got to read today, but you hear these stories and recognize there's one, we look them up and understand why they're where they are, but then what can we do better? The fact that a good 30% of your individuals that are incarcerated probably read below the 6th grade level, and you kind of learn their family, a little bit about their family history, and you say, well, this was, you are where you are, but how do we make this situation better overall for the entire system? And that's the big thing. It's like, how do we solve these difficult problems at scale? Individually, I can solve people's problems generally, but at scale, how do you solve these for a state with 22 million people, or a state with Department of Corrections that's managing 80,000 people that are incarcerated there, the other thousands of people that are corrections officers, and then deal with them on the returning basis too when they're coming back into society.
What is the transition like for them when they come back into society?
It's not good. They get $50 on a bus pass for the most part. Florida doesn't have parole, so we don't parole individuals out. We don't transition them in a real logical way. They largely end their sentence, and then they'll get money. And if they have a family to go back to, they get a family. And if they don't, they get put on a bus and shipped away.
Wow. You summed it up brilliantly. What can we do better? I don't know what else to say than that after what you've explained. It's heart-wrenching.
Yeah, it's the system is just broken in so many levels. And frankly, that we know that we can look at around the country and see these examples of what other states have done to improve public safety, to treat people more humanely, and to create a better overall system that frankly is just utilizing resources better and in a more efficient way. And unfortunately, we run into the headwinds of law enforcement. We run into the headwinds of politics, but it doesn't mean the solution is different. We've got to power through it. And oftentimes in the legislature, you have to have the right window of time to act. And so while I've been here a decade now, the window's been open for a very few short periods on certain topics. But I think broadly, the window will be open, much wider in the future. And we just, even if I'm not involved in the legislature anymore, I still think I'm going to be involved in that topic, working on statewide solutions.
It's a meaningful topic to your heart, and I know you personally, and you deeply care. You're not putting on a facade. I want to just emphasize that to you deeply care, and it's definitely genuine.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, I think our faith calls on us to do these types of things, and so for me, it's acting out on that, but then realizing that what I've always tried to do is put us on a sustainable long-term path. And in any area where I don't feel like we're following that sustainable path, I kind of go back to Ben Stein's dad. His name was Herb Stein. One of my favorite comments in politics is his comment. It's called Stein's Law. And Stein's Law is pretty simple. It's things that are unsustainable tend to stop, right? And what we see is where we're not on these sustainable paths, these trajectories, we see these things stopping. We see it in the Department of Corrections. We see it in the world of insurance in Florida, where we're starting to see these multitude of failures that are occurring. And it's because clearly they haven't established themselves on a sustainable trajectory.
You're trying to avoid that now with your COVID-19 liability protection bill. You see what you've got: the ambulance chasers circulating. Oh, wow, we can go sue. There's going to be a COVID incident. How's that working? And I want to point out, as a father of a young daughter in school, you included liability protection for schools. And for all the parents out there that I speak to, they all want me to say thank you.
Well, for us, I mean, look, for all of the wonderful benefits that Florida has, one of the challenges is we're considered a judicial hellhole. My joke is, if you look up in Florida, you're going to see two things: the sun and the face of a trial attorney on a billboard. And that's just the unfortunate reality that we find ourselves in is that over decades, we have allowed this kind of sue and settle culture to pervade in Florida and persist in Florida. And we've got to begin to turn the tide there and create a different environment where businesses can more freely operate. And especially, I mean, nothing highlights that like the sharks that are circling the different healthcare organizations for COVID liability. You know, whether it be nursing homes, ALFs that were left without PPE, where, you know, trash bag, a shower cap, and a homemade mask was the personal protective equipment for 4 or 5 months, and a thermometer pressed against your head was a COVID test of any type of rational reason. We basically asked our healthcare providers to MacGyver their way through a pandemic. And now on the back end, we're not, you know, some of my colleagues are not willing to stand up there and say, listen, we're going to provide you some liability protection, or many of them are going to get sued out of existence. For the most part, business interruption, general liability insurance has not covered pandemics for a decade. Oh, well, really since 2006 and SARS. So many of these companies are bare when it comes to insurance, and frankly couldn't afford one lawsuit, let alone 50 or 60-year class action.
It's important that we have the liability protection so individuals can have a job and not have to worry about the company getting sued into oblivion. So an ambulance chaser can go from an ambulance chaser to a limousine chaser. And the other important aspect of that is that they don't have to worry because their children can go to school. And Governor DeSantis made the bold decision that I applaud him every day for, to open the schools and keep the schools open. That's going to have such a tremendous impact on our children 10, 15 years from now, where Florida's education system is going to be number one in the nation by and far. As a legislator in the Florida Senate, what went into that decision to open the schools and keep the schools open?
Well, I think that was the best decision he's made since the beginning of COVID. I would put that as number one, and then reopening businesses as number two. And then our vaccine strategy probably is as third. But I think ultimately that decision is really what has catapulted him on the national scene, because frankly, he was an outlier amongst the large states. You know, he was, I think, the first to come out and said parents are going to have options, but one of those options is to get your kids back in school. And so therefore, in order to give parents those options, all the schools need to be open. And it's been amazing to watch the transition of parents who originally said, no, I'm going to keep my kids at home, now ask their kids to go back to school or make their kids go back to school in order to get better learning, because many kids were really struggling learning virtually. And I think that's going to be the story of Florida versus these other states, where these kids, we're going to see real learning gains in Florida, where you're going to see learning losses in some of these other states that have been in lockdown and are only sending their kids to school 1 or 2 days a week.
And every tragedy always has a silver lining. And to me, one of the silver linings is that we've moved to a digital economy 5 years faster. But also, individuals are realizing the power of Florida. Your children can go to school in person, and companies are flocking down here in droves. The wealth management's flying out of New York, coming down here. The technology industry with Miami is just completely booming, and fintech is coming down here. 5 years ago, did you ever imagine Florida becoming this giant home to new emerging innovation and technology?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways the conversation about autonomy has kickstarted that, especially down in Miami, right? Because now it's, you know, Miami was a cool city before, but now we've kind of continued to bolt and trick it out by giving all of these other options to the city. And frankly, we've created this environment where technology can thrive and where the taxes are of a lower nature, where it's a strong incentive to consider relocating here. So Florida's growing by about 600 to 800 people a day. And we see that trend continuing for the next decade. And that is driving many of these other businesses to look at coming here and recognizing that the legislature has kept spending under control, as opposed to New York and Connecticut and some of these other states, which are just wild. Their budgets are wildly out of line. And so, you know, when you're a resident of those states, you know that taxes are only going to go up. In Florida, you have a legislature that's fighting to keep taxes as low as possible and trying to shrink them every year.
And I'll never forget it. You go down to Miami in 2018 for the Argo AI announcement, the public thing, and everybody's saying, "Oh, why Miami? Why Miami?" And we don't get it. And now it's like, okay, how fast can we get to Miami? Now we understand why Argo chose Miami.
Yeah, right. There's multiple conversations that I've had with companies that want to deploy in Florida and are looking specifically at Miami, because it's such a great hub of activity, and because young engineers are willing to consider it now. Whereas maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that wasn't on their top 10 list. When you're saying, hey, look, you can go work for Argo or one of these other major companies that's down there, and you're going to be you're beginning to build that ecosystem that we talked about earlier of talent. And now you have more and more universities looking to supply employees to those types of businesses. And so you get into this positive feedback loop that really was, was a catalyst based on a story of mobility.
And now there's the companies that can write the big checks. You don't have to go to Silicon Valley to get the check anymore. There's the family offices that have relocated down there that can write you a $100 million check. There's the Blackstones that can write you a multi-billion-dollar check. So you don't have to leave Miami, which is an incredible positive. And I want to go back in memory here. In 2020, we went to CES as part of the Florida delegation together. You met with all these companies and told the Florida story, and some were mixed reactions. But I guarantee you, when we go back in 2022, it's going to be a whole different story. There's going to be a line of companies, and Senator Brandes, how can we relocate to Florida? How do you see that playing out?
No, I think that's true. I mean, I think ultimately, these companies want what's best for their employees. They want to operate in a state that is forward thinking, and they want to operate in a state where, frankly, you can go out and have lunch or have a dinner in a public space. And so when we tell that story, I think it's very, very positive. And talk about the education institutions being open, talk about the university talent, talk about the freedom that you have here, which is very different than what you're hearing these conversations are in other states.
The state is giving individuals the right to make their own decisions. We're adults, we make decisions. And it's powerful. You're not micromanaging.
Come back to, when we started this conversation, and talked about capitalism and freedom and kind of being a more libertarian mindset. And I think our governor has a libertarian bent to him, at least in my conversations with him. And frankly, I think that's where a lot of young people are. They're more in the libertarian camp than they are in many of the other camps that we try to put them nicely into.
You're 100% right. They're free thinkers. They believe in technology and innovation, and they don't want to be told what to do. And Florida's appealing to them because it has a framework where you can have a great quality of life. You can raise a family, and you can get a really good job. And you were with the governor in DeSantis in June of 2019 when he signed HB 311, which, in my opinion, opened the floodgates for autonomy to move to Florida. And in a press release, you stated the following: over the next 10 years, we will see more innovation in the transportation industry than we've seen over the last 50 years. I couldn't agree with you more. Now that things have kind of changed, we're getting the backside of COVID. What major changes do you see coming, and where do you see them coming in Florida?
So I think the biggest change you're going to see is the shift to electrification. So electric vehicles are less than 0.5% of vehicles on Florida's roads today. If you talk to Adam Jonas at Morgan Stanley, he'll tell you we think that's going to be between 20-30% of all new cars sold by 2030 will be electric. And if you see the major OEMs making their announcements, seems like almost on a daily basis right now, about their commitment to making that shift. So I think that's the big transition. And frankly, Florida's got to be part of that because we've got to now upgrade our grid. We're a state that every now and then evacuates 1 million people. We've got to be prepared for that when we have hurricanes. So we need to be thinking about those transitions today, making sure we have our planning in place today for the long term. So if that's the transition we see between 2020 and 2030, I think autonomy getting online, this whole shift to delivery, that model, whether it be companies like Neuro that I think will be exploring Florida shortly or others, I think this whole that's a 2025 to 2030 conversation, in my opinion. And then the larger shift to autonomy coming on the later end of this decade, beginning making its huge strides between 2030 and 2040.
100% agree on the timeline. And you mentioned evacuation hurricanes. As I moved here, we're here, I think, a month, and I call you up and say, Senator, we got a hurricane warning. And I said, how do I evacuate? And you were very kind, and you helped us through that in the procedure. But how are we going to evacuate electric vehicles? Is there going to have to be portable roadside charging, as if the roads get backed up, if let's individuals, instead of going to Orlando, are going all the way to Georgia? Has the state started to plan for that yet?
They have, yeah. We've begun our initial plans. In fact, we've seen a couple of the early drafts that have come out to think about some of these different options, whether those be kind of batteries that are contained, or a generator that's contained inside of a shipping container that we can drop at a number of locations. But I think ultimately what you need is diffused, options, and you can't just have centralized options, or you're going to have 150 cars backed up waiting for 20, 30 minutes to get out. but it really takes some logical planning, recognizing that most people are going to be pretty much fully charged by the time they leave their home. And then, kind of where is that 200-300 mile range that they can get to? And then where are the options for the back roads that we can provide as well to give people multiple options? It's got to, in some ways, it's got to look like gas stations. And so we need to, even if we have to supplement certain gas stations to install faster charging stations so that we can have more access, but ultimately we're going to need those types of options.
I fully agree with you. We saw news out of the UK where Shell is starting to remove some of the pumps and make them electric vehicle charging stations. And bold move there. BP's doing it. I'll be really curious here in the States what Chevron and Exxon are going to do. And I'm looking at going, say, from South Florida to Northern Florida. Will there come to a point where the legislature will allow electric vehicle charging on state roads?
So it allows it on state roads today. I think the big thing for us, and one of the things I'm actually pushing right now, is currently there's a federal ban against allowing charging stations at rest areas on federal interstates. The Flying J's of the world, the bigger truck stops of the world have pushed to not allow for other retail activity at rest stops. So I think we need to allow rest stops to be utilized for electric vehicle charging. And so that's one of the things we're actually talking to our congressman about right now is pushing for some more flexibility, even if it's just in emergency situations. We need to be prepared and utilizing those facilities for that.
That'd be wonderful. It's creating meaningful value for society. It's the old ways of locking somebody out with legislation is silly when society is clearly shifting to an electric future.
Right. Well, I mean, look, we have electric vehicle charging stations that are in the turnpike because the state owns that asset, but we don't have them at rest stops, which seemed like a great natural fit for somebody to go out, stretch their legs for 15, 20 minutes. And especially as charging rates increase, you can see that long-term being a very beneficial asset to the state as having that. So I think even if we can get an emergency exemption to allow us to put them out there for federally declared emergencies, we've got to have more options out and available.
And if you can do that, that's an incredible positive step in the right direction. On the backside that you mentioned, the energy grid, we're seeing the unfortunate catastrophe in Texas right now. If 50% of Florida residents' primary vehicle was an EV, could the Florida grid handle that demand?
It's hard to imagine how they could right now, but I think in the future they will be able to. I mean, clearly we're going to have to upgrade everything. And that's why you're seeing, firms like Berkshire making such huge investments in energy firms right now and frankly, utility firms, because they see this future happening, playing out that way too. I think by that time, by 2030, by 2035, you're going to see a lot more battery integration into the existing grid itself in order to kind of get away from peaker plants and some of the other backup systems that they have today. And so I think it's just another way to diffuse that challenge is you're realizing that you're going to have to, this is a technology problem as much as it is an infrastructure problem right now. And so we're going to have to kind of fuse that and let innovators do what they do best, which is solve these difficult problems.
Innovators do solve difficult problems, and that's a really great segue as we look to wrap this up. I'd love to ask you, what is the current state of innovation in the state of Florida from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I think whether it be our universities, whether it be the small businesses that are relocating here, I think one thing that we've historically been missing, but we're starting to see more growth of, is that angel seed capital that's starting to be domiciled in Florida. I think people want to make investments close to their money, which is why it used to be, we would have people from California fly here, invest in a Florida business, and then try to immediately take them back to California so that they could watch that business grow. And I think as those individuals from New York and Atlanta and California relocate to Florida, they're going to be willing to make similar types of investments, but they're going to want those investments now to stay in Florida versus moving out of state. And I think that's a fundamental shift that's occurred in just the last handful of years.
Totally agree, because that's the Andreessen Horowitz, where they wouldn't invest unless you were on the peninsula or in San Francisco. That was their investment philosophy, that they had to be there to mentor you, to give you access to the resources. And now we're having that here, and there's really great things in your neck of the woods in Tampa happening. There's really great things happening in Miami. There's great things happening on the Space Coast, Orlando, and it's not just one pocket, which is a beautiful thing about Florida. It's happening in different regions throughout the state. And Senator Brandes, as we wrap up this insightful conversation, which has been super interesting, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
Well, I think the number one takeaway is Florida's a great state to do business. The conversations you can have here with our both elected officials and with the Department of Transportation and county and city officials it's not the first time they've heard these conversations. They've all had conversations about self-driving. They're having ongoing conversations about electrification. We've wrestled with the Uber and Lyft question and rideshare and have a great statewide law as it relates to that. They're dealing with scooters and very familiar with that, but they all have the similar problem. They have this problem where they have hundreds, if not thousands of people moving to their city on a weekly basis. And they are struggling with mobility challenges and they want to find new solutions. They want to innovate their way out of that problem. And so they're willing to sit down with you and have these types of discussions because they recognize this is the future and they're excited to be a part of it.
As you've heard Senator Brandes say here, Florida is the home of innovation and the future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is the big idea. Senator Brandes, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thanks, Grayson.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.